All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our final session of the day to State of the World 2021 here at Florida International University. And I'm David Kramer, and I'm going to be not only continuing as the MC for the day, but I have the privilege and honor of moderating this session with two distinguished members of the U.S. House of Representatives. And joining us is Congressman Ted Deutch, who represents Florida's 22nd District, home to communities throughout Southern Palm Beach County and Broward County, and now serving his 7th term in the 117th Congress. He's chairman of the House Ethics Committee. Something tells me he might be a little busy these days, and chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, and a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee. Also joining us is Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who is serving his 6th term. I know the bio says 5th, it's the 6th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 16th Congressional District, and he is a member of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and also sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And before being elected to Congress, Congressman Kinzinger served in the Air Force in both Operation Iraqi Freedom and in Operation Enduring Freedom. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us today. We're very grateful. We know it is an incredibly busy time in what has already been a tumultuous year after a very difficult 2020. But Congressman Kinzinger, if I can, let me start with you, because you've had a perhaps particularly busy weekend with the launch of a new video, countryfirst.com, that came out over the weekend. And the theme of our conference is the struggle for democracy. But the state of the GOP also seems to be struggling, and what happens to the GOP, the Republican Party, will have an impact on the democracy here in the United States. So where is the party headed in your view?
Well, I think that's the big question, right? And the thing that motivated me to initially basically just launch a video saying the truth, it's kind of turned into, in the last 24 hours, really the outlet for people that have felt disaffected. I think that road will be determined over the next few months. You know, we are the party that, as I mentioned, we freed the slaves. We took out communist tyranny. We fought for women's suffrage, and now we're the party that's spreading conspiracy theories and lies. And as you know, when it comes to things like democracy, information and conspiracy theories are some of the most detrimental to that in terms of having to rely on people's voice counting. So I don't know where the party is. I know that there needs to be an open and probably in public, like is happening, discussion. And we've got to put those competing visions. So in a bit of a nod to John McCain too, he was a good friend of mine. I respected his, he was basically like Secretary of State wherever he went. I loved meeting with people, but the country first is basically putting that back out front and say, we're a party that puts the country before we put, somebody like Donald Trump.
Congressman Deutch, as you look across the aisle to your Republican colleagues, what do you see of the prospects for bipartisanship on any domestic issues, but also any foreign policy issues?
Well, first, it's good to be with Representative Kinzinger for our second panel since Friday. And David, I just want to take the opportunity to tell Adam that I have heard from Republicans down here in South Florida who are grateful that there is an opportunity for them to reassert themselves as thoughtful, patriotic Republicans who may not always agree with me, but have really important views and feel like they've been pushed to the side, and they're grateful for the opportunity to re-engage through this effort of yours. So I wanted to pass that on, and which I think is a good lead-in, David, to your question about bipartisanship. The fact is that bipartisanship is critical if we're going to succeed in the world. And we focus so much on what happens here at home, but our greatest successes in the world, from the Marshall Plan through the transitions and democratic transitions in Central Europe, ending the Cold War, those were all bolstered by strong, broad bipartisan support, and we can't go back and forth being whipsawed from one extreme to another. And so I am hopeful that as we look to the challenges that we face right now, outside of our borders, the challenges that China poses, the challenge that Russia poses, the fact that in both of those instances and so many others around the world, our focus should be led by, in a bipartisan way, by our focus on human rights and the values that we share as Americans. That will afford us the opportunity to go forward in a bipartisan way. And I'm confident that certainly Representative Kinzinger and I and others on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think, share that same commitment. We may not always agree with every policy detail, but we agree that America in the world is critical, and that standing with our allies and strengthening multilateral institutions is an important part of that. A part of that, we need to lead, and that will only happen when we do it in a bipartisan way. Returning and turning inward causes great problems, not just I think at home, but around the world. And when we lead and when we do so together, we're going to be in a better position, a stronger position to take on these really significant challenges.
So Representative Kinzinger, let me turn the question a little bit back toward you. And I realize bipartisanship may be a term that's a little obsolete at this point, given the divides and splits in the Republican Party. But nevertheless, as you look at the issues and the statements and even the early actions President Biden has taken, do you see hope that Republicans and Democrats can work together on foreign policy issues?
Yeah, I do. And I think the key is there will always be it's tough to get bipartisanship on domestic policy, because a lot of times these parties are formed around domestic policy. And I think it's important for Republicans in this case to not think about, themselves as the opposition, but the loyal opposition, right? We'll oppose, we'll stand up for our values. We're going to take them to the American public in terms of debate, but we are loyal to the country above all else. And I know Ted and I, if we would travel overseas when COVID goes away, we will again, hopefully, I would never say anything bad about Joe Biden overseas. And because I still believe in that kind of showing that unified front. And so I think on foreign policy, there's a lot of areas where we're going to work together. There'll be some probably a little friction on things like the Iran nuclear deal and, Yemen and arms sales to UAE and Saudi Arabia. But what I've heard out of the administration so far on Russia, for instance, has been heartening. I thought the Trump administration policies on Russia were pretty good. A lot of those were pushed by Congress, but the words weren't. And now I think we're going to see words and actions match up, which is really important. Re-strengthening our allies in NATO and in some of those areas, and working in multilateral organizations to get to an end state. And it seems like they're recognizing, as I was hopeful for, the real strategic challenge of China. China's not our buddies. They can't be our buddies. But we also, aren't seeking to go to war with them, but we have to be clear-eyed. So I think there are a lot of areas where there's going to be good, broad, bipartisan cooperation. And what Ted and I have to do on the committee and in Congress is defend against, frankly, the extremes in both our parties that will try to hijack a committee hearing, for instance, and make it all about whatever, crazy thing that they want to make it about, and refocus on that, the fact that we are united.
Representative Deutch, just to stick to the domestic situation for a little bit longer, I wonder if you can give your reaction to the rather extraordinary warning that came out of the Department of Homeland Security last week about the potential violence by domestic extremists. This obviously is not out of the blue, given what happened on January 6th, but what does that say about the state of affairs in this country?
Well, it says a couple things. First of all, it's not just the state of affairs in this country, but there's a global aspect to that, David. And I just wanted to, I wanted to just circle back for 1 second, because this ties back into your question. The meetings that Representative Kinzinger referred to, traveling with John McCain, when he went anywhere, raising the issues that he knew needed to be raised as Americans. At so many of those meetings and events, we were joined also by Vice President Biden and Senator Biden before that. So I think there is that clear understanding of what it means to work together on these shared priorities in foreign policy. What happened on the 6th and the warning that's come out since is a reminder not to just take seriously threats against members of Congress and against the Capitol, but it's a reminder, frankly, that the threat to democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, extremism, white nationalist terrorism, is one that is now front and center in our own country, that we experience the results of it, that we need to be vigilant in combating it, and that we need to recognize the global aspects of it as we go forward, because we're not unique here. I'm sorry to say, we thought we were, because we thought this would never, no one could have imagined what we saw on January 6th. But having now experienced that, I hope it means, and I'm confident it means, that we'll rededicate ourselves to standing up for the very idea of democracy, both here and with our democratic allies around the world.
And Congressman Kinzinger, let me now shift overseas and ask you, if the Biden administration, if President Biden called you up and asked you for a list of, say, the top 3-4 threats facing this country, what would you put on that list?
So the very first, I think, and this has changed even from maybe a few weeks ago, the very biggest threat, I think, to democracies and to America is misinformation. And, I think for the first time in history, we have something that outperforms the human brain, and that is, the learning of the machine learning, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, the internet, and people going into these black holes of conspiracies. And I think it was also accelerated by COVID, because people are at home, bored, go on the internet, and now they're angry, and now they lack human interaction. But that is the biggest threat to democracies. We saw what that did to us. But if you look all around the world, I mean, for instance, Putin's really good at understanding that in any country, all you have to do is stoke a little bit of racial tension or ethnic tension or religious tension, and you can create an untenable situation. And it's hard to give a really, magical speech to overcome that when people feel those deep-seated hate. So I think that's number one. Number two is China. And I think recognizing that, we're not going to totally decouple from China, but it's important on national security to find areas where we need to, whether it's vaccine and medicine production, whether it's things like, the F-35 having close to like 300 pounds of rare earth metals in it. What do you do if China cuts off our supply of rare earth metals? How do we fix that? As well as, of course, defending Taiwan, the rights of the people of Hong Kong and South China Sea, et cetera, and continuing to have a military that's not just big, but is big and effective where it needs to be. And then Russia, I think, the Russian both misinformation campaign, their destabilization of Europe, using energy as a weapon. I mean, I got the, the Nord Stream 2 sanctions in, and it appears that we finally put the nail in Nord Stream 2, but they're going to try to resurrect it and go with other areas. And so American energy production is extremely important as well, to be able to be a soft power rebuttal to that. But there's so many things that there's, as you know, but I think those are the top three that probably would be more what I would say would keep you up at night.
And Congressman Deutch, maybe the same question to you, but also if you want to answer it in a way to put forward the greatest challenges that may not necessarily be threats.
Well, I think it's interesting the way Representative Kinzinger put that. I think the challenge of misinformation leads directly into the threat of the threats to democracy. So I do think that that we need to consider that. And by the way, that the very nature of this conversation about threats to democracy taking place at a time when we see around the world journalists jailed, when we see human rights activists silenced, when we see, as we have this conversation with Navalny in prison and his wife being arrested and fined for protesting, we always tend to focus rightly on the immediate threats of China and of Russia and Iran, I would suggest, and their activities in the region and the very real threat that they pose as they now advance closer to a nuclear weapon than they've been since before the Iran nuclear deal. As we have those conversations, we have them also at a time when in each of those countries, human rights, the lack of freedoms, continue to be the challenge that so often leads to the threats and the crises that we face. And we need to always stand up against that, whether we're talking about Navalny, when we're talking about the Uyghurs, or whether we're talking about the repression of activists and citizens in Iran, just as three examples. That always has to be front and center.
But Congressman Kinzinger, let me ask you, there are some who would argue, not just in this country, but overseas as well, that given the challenges we've experienced here in the United States, not just on January 6th, but for quite a while now, the United States has lost its ability, if not obligation, to defend and support human rights and democracy advocates. How would you respond to comments like that?
Well, I think certainly it's taken a hit. And I think when it comes to things like human rights, we're still a country that leads the world in human rights. We have every moral authority to talk about the Uyghurs in China, for instance. And I think, but when it comes to things like democracy and misinformation, yeah, it has taken a bit of a hit. And I think we have to recognize that. We have to admit it, but we also have to use that as the opportunity to talk about, look, the US has been here before and we've always overcome. And I think the biggest message out of January 6th is A, we have a lot of work to do, but B, democracy that day held. And it's interesting, I talked to one of the police officers who was on CNN, and he was the one that was dragged and kicked and, had a heart attack and a TBI. And I mean, this whole story that I talked to him is crazy. Interestingly, he probably is on my side of the aisle, but he was so angry. And he was telling me the story about, basically 1,500 officers, 850 of them were Metro PD, so DC police officers, that were basically in hand-to-hand combat with people with one goal in mind, and that is defend this institution. They cannot get in. He was upset, people are attacking us for not arresting people when all these people were arrested in the summer. He goes, we didn't have bodies to arrest people, and we had no places to put the people we arrested because it was medieval. And so I use that as an example to say, as terrible as the 6th was, and there have to be massive repercussions, it is really a pretty great story about how democracy held. And just 6 hours later, Congressman Deutch and I were on the floor taking votes, and we went on. And so that will need a longer arc of history to brag about, but I do think it's definitely could be a point to, in countries that have difficulties to talk about.
Congressman Deutch, some tainted moral authority, but we still have the authority and obligation to speak out.
We do. Yeah, absolutely we do. That said, Adam is right to describe what happened that day. It was a challenge to our democracy, but the democracy held, and we were on the House floor certifying the outcome of the election at 3 o'clock in the morning. Those who wanted to impede the peaceful transition, those who wanted to stop our democracy in its tracks, failed. That said, it is now just several weeks later, and there is another challenge to democracy and our leadership that we play in the world when members of Congress are able to espouse pernicious, dangerous conspiracy theories, so many of them anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic in nature, and then the whole range of conspiracy theories about 9/11, about the mass shootings that have taken place in our country, suggesting they didn't. Members who have threatened to kill members of leadership. There is another challenge that we face right now when those kinds of words are rewarded with positions on prominent House committees, and for us to continue to assert the kind of moral authority that I think we can have historically and need to going forward, we have to send a clear message to the rest of the world that as much as important as the First Amendment is in our country, so too is the importance of what we project to the rest of the world, that is our belief in truth and are willing to stand against these kinds of awful and dangerous conspiracy theories.
So let me start turning to some questions that we're getting in, and please, to our audience, feel free to send in questions through the Q&A function. But one question I got is, about China and the upcoming Olympics there. And Congressman Kinzinger, if I can maybe turn to you for this one. Do you think that the Olympics should take place in China in 2022? Should the U.S. boycott in light of what's going on with arrests of people like Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow and the threats to Taiwan, the South China Sea activity, a whole list of behavior that raises serious concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not going to, make headlines now by saying we should boycott it or anything. I'm not sure, the benefit of that. Obviously, we're struggling from not having the Olympics last year, and I think there's real benefits to doing that. But it is an important point, which is there's a lot of human rights stuff going on in China that's being swept under the rug. If you look at the fact that the Chinese Communist Party spends more money on internal security than they do on their military, that's a fact they don't like when you say. When you look at the fact that there's this debt diplomacy going around that is holding hostage a lot of these countries that are going to go there and compete in the Olympics, and you look at the fact that frankly there's a lot of unknown questions about how the COVID-19, how that both left China and China's attempts to cover it up and et cetera. I do think it's a legitimate question. I don't want to go out yet and say boycott, but I do think it is really important for us to continue to bring these for the forefront. China, by the way, Chinese Communist Party responds pretty well to public pressure. They understand that their hold on power is important for their country, and I think that's important. And by the way, lastly, I'll say all you have to do is look at some of the speeches by President Xi himself, not the English translations that the government provides, and you'll see in there comments like the racial, the ethnic, the moral superiority of the Chinese people, stuff that any other world leader could never get away with saying.
Great, thanks. Representative Deutch, let me ask Mia Plagman's question, a public administration student and interested in a path to legislation and public policy. And one of the things that's obviously important to a school like the Green School is restoring trust in public service. So what advice would you give to students who are thinking about looking into careers in government and public service, whether it's on the Hill, executive branch, the military, local government, whatever the case may be?
I would, first of all, I would say thank you, and yes, and particularly, David, students at the Green School who have the opportunity while they're there to learn from one another in a place with however many countries represented. It's good, vibrant international community should absolutely commit to going forward with and seeing that goal. I believe that the work that we do in public service, the work that we're talking about here, is critical, not just for a well-functioning country, but the opportunity that it provides to really take your values and commitment, one's commitment to human rights and the opportunity for others to express themselves freely, taking those values and putting them into action. That's not something that you can do in just any profession. And if you have the opportunity and the inclination and the will, then by all means, I encourage people to pursue that. I think it is, we need people who are committed to advancing these values. And I encourage people to reach out to me if they have questions about this. I think talking to young people who might be interested in serving the public good is one of the most important things that I get to do. So I would be happy to speak further to that student or any others, and I can't encourage this highly enough. Coming from the Green School, they're going to be in a good position because of what they've learned, the skills they've acquired, the knowledge that they have. But beyond that, it's the commitment and the passion that really makes a difference. And if they've got it, they should use it.
Thanks very much. I couldn't agree more. The students here are absolutely amazing. I'm impressed every single day that I meet with them, and fortunate to interact with them in class. Congressman Kinzinger, Amory Pescaro, International Business Senior at FIU, has a question for you that basically boils down to, whether opposing Donald Trump is equivalent to political suicide. How would you respond to that?
I would respond by saying, stay tuned, right? I think that's the big fight, and the big question is, you know, you have to look at how we've gotten here, and I think leaders have forgotten. And this is to go to Congressman Deutch's point. It's why it's so important for people to get involved in public service, not as activists, but as servants, you know, that want to do good. Because I think, frankly, the generation my age and younger is going to be the one that has to save this country, and we need that. But is it political suicide? I don't know. What I know is that for the last number of years, we have not led the American people, and we've let people like Donald Trump create the narrative. You know, we've gotten to a point in politics where we look at polling, we look at opinions, and we say, what do we have to say in order so that people think I represent them best and get elected? And when you're a party that, like the Republican Party was, that has a common set of ideals and principles, that's not a bad thing, because you know then if you get in power what you're going to do. But now I can't really tell you what Republican policies and principles are, at least as of today. I know what they were and I know what they need to be. But I made the decision, you know, look, I've been in Congress this is starting my 11th year. If this is it, then I'm at peace with the fact that I will have done everything I can to save this, but people need to hear the truth. And that's what leaders do. Leaders come out and say, it may not be easy to do, but I'm going to tell you the truth amidst the darkness. I'm going to show you what justice looks like among a lot of injustice. And I really believe that probably ultimately, you know, it'll be rewarded with re-election because I think people respect it, but I'm at total peace if it doesn't, because quite honestly, I never intended to do this job for the rest of my life. And but being able to go to bed at night and be at peace is more important than really anything.
Well said. Representative Deutch, if I can, this may be your last question. Unfortunately, this 30 minutes has gone very quickly. But Andres Avila is asking about recognition of Juan Guaido in Venezuela. And as you know, this issue, Venezuela as well as Cuba, are of huge interest down here in South Florida. I wonder if you could comment on what the Biden administration should do when it comes to maybe both of those countries, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let's start with the obvious, which I think you touched on in the question, David. That is the horrific damage that's been done to Venezuela, to the people of Venezuela, the enormous challenges that we face as a result. Before the pandemic, when I was down in Colombia and we went to the border, and there's no better symbol for the awful repression you see in Venezuela and what Maduro does than the blockade that's up on the bridge just across from Colombia, with warehouses full of goods, humanitarian goods that are ready to be delivered. So I think going forward, it's you can look to what Secretary Blinken said during his confirmation hearing. We're not going to rescind recognition of the steps that have been taken. As he talked about Cuba and talked about Venezuela, we want to target sanctions more effectively. We want to make sure that in the case of Cuba, that with an American flag flying there, that it actually represents, it's clear what it represents. We want to provide more assistance. We want to be able to help the people of Cuba and the people of Venezuela, and being targeted about it is the way to go. But make no mistake, when we talk about democracy and human rights, we sometimes have a tendency to look abroad. We have a tendency to look in every direction except south, and it is in our own hemisphere where we should be the most committed to advancing human rights. We want to restore Venezuelan democracy. We want free and fair elections, and we recognize that that just as we have recognized Guaido that we will continue to, but the goal needs to be free and fair elections. The goal needs to be, again, democracy in Venezuela, democracy in Cuba, democracy for our region.
Congressman Deutch, thank you. Let me bring this session, unfortunately, to an end because it's been a fascinating conversation. As you know, I asked the two of you to appear together because I think trying to strike notes of bipartisanship in this very polarized time is critically important. I think we picked two of the best to represent that spirit of bipartisanship. I hope some of your colleagues will do similar sessions with members on both sides of the aisle. But for today, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Congressman Ted Deutch, extraordinarily grateful to the two of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules. Thanks very much. And you have an open invitation to FIU and the Green School anytime.
You bet. See ya. Thanks. Good
Thanks
to see
so
you,
much, David.
Thank you,
Thanks,
gentlemen.
Adam.
And that brings an end to day one of State of the World 2021 here at Florida International University. Tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. and we're going to start at 9 a.m. every day the rest of this week because we have a lot to cover. So please join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. where we will begin with a discussion about a terrific book on James Baker with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. And we have lots more interesting discussions tomorrow. So thanks very much for joining us on day one. I'm David Kramer. We'll see you tomorrow.
Extending to the end like an elbow, fingers getting stuck to the money, Velcro. Will I ever well known to OG like a pair of shell toes? Never mad, just motivated. We going places, and life is a game, so it comes with stages. We only trading money, we not trading places. Benji Franklin's is my favorite, only face I'm ever saving. Working hard for that #1 spot. No, we can never be stopped. I work, stay over dedicated. I work, gotta be the greatest. I work, all it takes is patience. I work, let's go.
One, two, three, four.
Let's work. How you get a whip so clean? I work. How you get to buy nice things? I work. Why you don't live like me? I work. Let's work.